truth is the most convincing story that maps onto reality, and that's why the central narrative is falling apart.
Right now in the United States, people should not be walking around with masks.
We must see the central narrative for the fiction that it is. We are Americans.
While elections are sometimes messy, this was a secure election.
The founders began the fight for human liberty and self-governance, and it's up to us to finish the job.
I'll tell you what, we are in a truth emergency right now.
This is the end game.
It's Thursday, April 27th, 2023, the 827th day of dystopia. I'm your moderator, Chris Paul. Let's be reasonable. A warm welcome and hello to all of you listening to the podcast on the day of its release. The only way to do that is by becoming a paid subscriber at imyourmoderator.substack.com. You can do so for as little as $50 a year or $5 a month. And in doing so, you will be supporting me, the work I do, and this show as it expands. And if you can't, or you simply don't want to, continue listening to the podcast for free on a wide variety of podcast platforms and, of course, Rumble. All I ask is that you share it with your friends. You can find the links to the podcast, the writing, the social media, and the merch site by visiting linktree.com/I'm your moderator. So, as I mentioned at the end of the episode yesterday, I want to focus a little bit on the Twitter files, catch up with the unfolding story about what all of us realized and could prove 3 years ago. But before we talk about the government's attacks on free speech on Twitter, let's talk about a potential amendment to Minnesota's House File 181. And rather than describing the bill for you, let's just listen to some of the debate.
Niska.
Thank you, Madam Speaker and Representative Vang. If a Minnesotan writes an article claiming or arguing that COVID-19 is a Chinese bioweapon that leaked from a lab in Wuhan, and someone reports that article to the Department of Human Rights, is that something that the Department of Human Rights should put in their bias registry under your bill?
Representative Vang.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Representative Niska, not all incidents are considered, I guess, violent or criminal, as I said before. And so this clearly, with the rhetoric that we have seen since the pandemic and regarding accusing Asians of bringing in the coronavirus, that is bias motivated. And so that can be considered a bias incident.
Representative Niska.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I think I heard yes to that, which is very troubling to me, that someone making a factual argument along those lines, I think is something that's within political discourse would be included in the Department of Human Rights database. Let me ask you another question, though, if Representative Vang would yield.
She will yield. Representative Niska.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And Representative Vang, if a Minnesotan is wearing a T-shirt that says "I love J.K. Rowling" and someone sees that and reports them to the Minnesota Department of Human Rights as an example of gender identity or gender expression bias, is that something that the Minnesota Department of Human Rights should put in this bias database?
Representative Vang.
Thank you, Madam Speaker and Representative Niska. I think this question will best be answered by the lawyers. I'm not a lawyer myself. I think in the language of the provision, we have looked at the language to make sure that a substantial part of any incident has to be relating to bias and hate and motivated. And so I will, I'm not going to say a yes or no to that question. It is really up to the those investigating to decide whether there is substances.
So the New York Post writes of this bill. The bill introduced in January would allow people to report perceived bias-related incidents, such as alleged slurs and verbal attacks, that would fall outside the hate crimes compiled annually by the State Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, according to the St. Cloud Times. So you just heard some of that debate there. Representative Niska was questioning Representative Samantha Vang, obviously a Democrat, about what sorts of speech, what sorts of incidents could be added to this hate speech database that they're trying to prop up. Would you be added if you said true things about the coronavirus at the wrong time? Because that's basically what the Wuhan lab claims and claims about the China virus were. They were true at the time, but you weren't allowed to say them because we were told it was going to inspire anti-Asian hate. And I have no doubt that in a country of 300 some odd million people, there may have been incidents where people said mean things to Asian people because of the China virus. And while that's very sad, I hope that people were able to get through hearing mean things and continue on to lead productive lives. I know that impolite words can really destroy a person, especially when a random stranger says them in passing on the street. Sticks and stones can break your bones, and apparently words can also break your bones and destroy your very spirit, turning the world into one vast nothing, your place inside it totally unknown and unknowable. And because the threat of impolite words is so great, we have to make sure that no one will ever say things that are impolite. And once we've agreed that impolite words should be illegal and no one should be allowed to get away with saying them, well, all you have to do at that point is just define more things as impolite, and you can shut down any speech you like. So you can't talk about the coronavirus coming from China because if some Asian person gets offended, then you have committed hate speech and apparently a thought crime, and that just won't do. If you wear a shirt that says, "I heart J.K. Rowling," and a trans person gets triggered because J.K. Rowling says impolite things about trans people, now your t-shirt is similarly impolite and you probably have to go to prison now. They are making it so that you can be reported to the Department of Human Rights if someone finds your words offensive, and they are able to claim that your intent in those words was to be offensive and target hate speech at somebody or some group of people. And so Representative Niska was just asking, what are the bounds of this? Is there any sort of limiting principle here at all? And obviously, Samantha Vang, the Democrat representative, had no idea. That clip we just heard makes it unclear as to whether Vang herself has even read the bill. She essentially admits that she doesn't understand it. We're going to pass this bill. We don't know what the limiting principle is. There isn't one. We don't know which sorts of events would be included and necessitate reporting under this bill. The lawyers are going to figure that out. They're going to do the legal reading of the bill, and at some point down the line, they will have a better understanding. What she's setting out is a sliding scale that can be applied to virtually anything, and they're supposing the person's intent. She's saying that people are going to get listed in this database, this hate speech database, based on their motivation for speaking. If they determine that the motivation is hateful, you go on the list. It's become almost redundant at this point to call something Orwellian, but this is essentially straight out of Orwell. This is basically to the point where you can be listed on a government database of human rights violators for thought crimes. You really have to wonder how far they'll take this. If someone says something on social media, for instance, and a bunch of people notice it and get upset at it, they can form a social media mob, all report whoever made the post for their human rights violations, their impolite speech, and then that person is on a database with report after report after report of their hate speech. What then? Does a certain number of reports make it a hate crime to be saying the no-no words too often? Does it become a justification for people to make claims under red flag laws so that weapons can be removed from whoever they deem to have committed these thought crimes, these potential instances of hate speech? There really are no limiting principles here. It would be interesting if this all got flipped around. I mean, of course, they would never allow it to work this way because they'll set up the board that chooses what people's motivations are. But there's a good case to be made that if all of that should put you on the database, what about all of the articles and blogs and social media posts and podcasts that talk about how bad white people are all the time? Do those conversations land you on the database? I kind of doubt it. So let's talk about the Twitter files. This is Twitter files number 20. And it's compiled by a man named Andrew Lowenthal, who goes by N-Effects on Twitter, Network Effects. The Information Cartel. He attaches 3 screenshots in the opening post. The first, the Department of Defense awarded a 5-year, $979 million contract to Peraton to counter misinformation specifically originating from adversaries of the United States. Another screenshot, Atlantic Council, 360 OS, Vanguard 25. A notice about a summit they were holding from June 21st to 23rd in Berlin, Germany. The 360 OS Open Source Summit will be supported by the Vanguard 25 or V25, an exclusive group of decision makers ranging from the C-suite to the Situation Room on the front line of forging digital resilience. This is a group that will meet under Chatham House rules to create a discreet and honest way to close the information gap on challenges like disinformation between key decision makers from government, tech, and media, as well as forge digital resilience and strengthen the integrity of our democratic societies. Our aim is to move from talk to action, providing a trusted environment to produce concrete strategy and real-time measures to build resilience across our hyper-connected society. And here are the listed participants. Madeleine Albright, the former U.S. Secretary of State. Carl Bildt, the former Prime Minister of Sweden. Richard Edelman. John Frank, the European Vice President of Microsoft. Stephen Hadley, former United States National Security Advisor. Wolfgang Ischinger, from the Munich Security Conference. Fred Kemp, from the Atlantic Council. Lydia Polgreen, the editor-in-chief of Huffington Post. And Maria Ressa, from an organization called Rappler. And in the third attachment, a screenshot of an email from a man named Garrett Graff on Friday, August 7th, 2020. The subject of the email, Hack and Leak Brainstorm This Morning. In the email, Graff writes, I've attached the working scenario right now. We're hoping that among us at 11 Eastern, we can reiterate this, refine it, complicate it, and polish a scenario that would help all of the group think through how they would respond to various twists and turns in a Burisma-focused leak incident this fall. Bring your most devious and cynical imaginations. Please keep this document confidential to yourselves. For various reasons, we don't want this to circulate widely. And you can imagine what those reasons are. First and foremost, everybody would know that the Hunter Biden laptop is Russian disinformation story would be complete and total BS. It's something that they were wargaming for months prior to the laptop ever coming to the knowledge of the American public. My name is Andrew Lowenthal, he writes. For almost 18 years, I was executive director of Engage Media, an NGO devoted to protecting digital rights and freedoms. In recent years, I watched with concern and then despair as a dramatic change swept through my field. Or maybe you realize that your field was just always set up to do exactly this. Organizations and peers began de-emphasizing freedom of expression, instead promoting surveillance and censorship to combat disinformation. Here, automated controversy detection and the Center for an Informed Public boast of their online monitoring capabilities. And he encloses a screenshot. Web crawlers crawlers that continuously monitor discourse on the most popular social media sites, as well as fringe forums where misinformation often originates. With a powerful stance detection algorithm, we can tell what's important and potentially opinion shifting before things become viral. Our aim is to study how ideas spread online in order to make this supercharged human communication more productive and less dangerous, and define a new standard for nuanced community discussions. Controversy detection, a pioneering algorithm that identifies opposing sentiment on a topic as well as quantifies the amount of disagreement. So they're essentially refining the ways that they can determine what sort of dissenting viewpoints are going to pose the biggest threat to the central narrative. So they bring out their story, their fake news story, their narrative that they're trying to disseminate to the public. People begin saying, hey, I think there's something wrong with that here and here and here and here and here. And as with any fake news story, there are plenty of ways to refute the things that are being said. The ones that people notice and begin spreading, those ones that gather momentum and threaten to break into the mainstream, those are the ones that immediately need to be shut down. We know how this process works. They understand that a counter narrative has started and they want to cut it off before it reaches too many people and begins to change opinions on a widespread basis. Still with this same screenshot, this year the CIP has been involved in a similar multi-institution research collaboration, the Virality Project, that's been tracking and analyzing COVID-19 vaccine misinformation and social media narratives related to vaccine hesitancy. Since January 2020, the CIP has collected more than 11 billion tweets and more than 100 terabytes of social media data as part of its rapid response mis- and disinformation research activities. Lowenthal writes, I knew things were bad. When I started working on the Twitter files, I learned they're far worse. The files show an uncanny alliance of academics, journalists, intelligence operatives, military personnel, government bureaucrats, NGO workers, and more. Some I know personally. And he includes a couple of more screenshot attachments. One shows the CC list from an email, all the attendees of this group meeting or workshop. And he redacts the names of the people, but you can still see the email extension. And so you've got Rutgers and Columbia and Tufts and Oregon State and Stanford and Princeton, and the list goes on and on. You've got multiple people from Microsoft and then DARPA. A whole lot of DARPA. That's the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. Lowenthal writes, I had always understood civil society to mean not the military. The former exists to check the latter. So I was shocked to see the depth of collaboration. For instance, civil society groups coordinating with Pentagon officials in an election tabletop exercise? Why? And he attaches another email with the CC list here, the subject of which is 2020 U.S. elections tabletop exercise. Also startling, Twitter emails and Slack communications suggesting heightened levels of data access for the military or military contractors like MITRE being part of the Aspen Institute's Information Disorder Report, along with NGO and academic colleagues. In a functioning democracy, there's dynamic tension between government, civil society organizations, news media, and industry, all advancing their own interests, in theory, keeping one another honest. In the Twitter files, we find them all working together, cartel style. And it's funny because that's basically the key understanding that picks the lock of virtually everything. We have been told and convinced over the course of our lives that all of these various organizations are acting in their own best interest. They want to achieve their own power and prosperity by excelling within their given field and embracing competition in hopes of succeeding. But it turns out they're actually just all working together so that they can help one another succeed at the expense of virtually everyone else. This leads to monopolistic activity and eventually centralized control, and that's what we see happening throughout our world. And once you come to this realization and fully accept it, you begin to understand that it was always this way. Lowenthal writes, in the Twitter files, tech firms collaborate with each other and the state. Companies organize industry sync, industry comms, pre-sync, and multi-party information sharing. All of these in quotes. These are how they refer to the processes that they're pursuing. Collaborating on a whole range of subjects, from election security to state media labeling. Tech companies not only collaborate on content, they gather regularly for quote-unquote private sector engagement with the FBI, DOD, DHS, House and Senate Intel committees, and others, each agency getting its own meetings. He attaches a screenshot of an email and writes, here Twitter staff ask for Twitter General Counsel and former FBI Deputy General Counsel Jim Baker's blessing for EIP and Virality Project partner Graphica to inform their partners in the U.S. government 3 to 5 days before publication of a report detailing Pentagon disinformation operations. The email is from William Newland at Twitter to Jim Baker, Yoel Roth, and Patrick Conlon. EIP is the Election Integrity Project. Graphica receives money from the Pentagon, Navy, and Air Force, while simultaneously supporting human rights organizations such as Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch. Lowenthal says, working with both the perpetrators and those representing the victims is very 2023. And I think he's got that right. During the War on Terror, the DHS was harshly criticized by progressives for civil rights violations and targeting of Muslims. Now, DHS sub-entities like CISA work closely with progressive tech. Here, Twitter warmly welcomes a DHS CISA staffer's job application. And CISA, of course, is the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. And you might remember their director, Chris Krebs, declaring that the election was the safest and most secure election in American history. This email is from Stasia Cardile at Twitter, and she's responding to an email inquiring about a job opening at Twitter. The name of who's inquiring about the job opening is redacted, but the person's title is not. Chief Countering Foreign Influence Task Force from the DHS, CISA, and NRMC. Cardile writes back with excitement, "Hi, very happy to receive your message. This role is basically the redacted replacement with a focus on elections and other national security issues. I'm happy to help you in whatever way I can. We should stay in close contact, and I am happy to help you through the application and interview process." She closes the email by saying, "It would be great to work with you in this ridiculous place." Back to Lowenthal. Other DHS staff, such as Matt Masterson, become fellows at the Stanford Internet Observatory and work on the Virality Project's censorship of quote-unquote true stories of vaccine side effects. The revolving door between academia, government, NGOs, and big tech is endless. As reported by Michael Schellenberger, the Aspen Institute combined Washington Post, New York Times, Rolling Stone, NBC, CNN, Twitter, Facebook, Stanford, and anti-disinformation NGOs like First Draft to practice an oddly prescient hack and leak exercise on the Hunter Biden laptop before its release. And Lowenthal includes the war-gamed scenario from the Aspen Institute. I'm going to read just a little bit of this because it's kind of incredible. So this is from September 2020, a month plus before the laptop was known to the public at all. So at the top, it says confidential. Aspen Digital Hack and Dump Working Group, September 2020. Exercise. The Burisma Leak. Day 1, Monday, October 5th. Anonymous website bidencrimes.info and a Twitter account at Hunter Lulz began posting documents that purport to be from Burisma tied to Hunter Biden. Splashed across the top of the site in English is, quote, "Joe Biden betrayed America before for money. He'll do it again." Initially, the documents, mostly in Ukrainian, appear to be minutes of various Burisma board meetings, internal emails, and financial records. There is initially no sign of a smoking gun. Note: the website appears to have been first registered in 2016. No ownership information is public. The Twitter account was created in 2014, oddly, just before Hunter joined the Burisma board. It is tweeted once and follows one person. Now, what's very interesting about this is if you go to bidencrimes.info right now, it takes you to the Marco Polo report on the Biden laptop. Now, that is quite the coincidence indeed. Day 2, Tuesday, October 6th. The Drudge Report links to the anonymous website, bidencrimes.info, and the site is quickly picked up by other fringe media and begins to spread on social media sites. And just a couple more highlights from their little scenario here because it's kind of fun, to be honest. Day 6, Saturday, October 10th. Overnight, progressive blogger Josh Marshall notices and tweets out one document in the new tranche of zip files that appears to be a confirmation of a wire transfer for $1 million from Deutsche Bank to an offshore account in the name of Hunter Biden, dated 2 days after the firing of the chief prosecutor, Shokin. Overnight, independent security researchers and news organizations find the majority of the zip files are authentic, but some are manipulated. And how often do we hear that? Well, there's some that are manipulated, so therefore you have to assume that all of them are potentially inauthentic. First Draft News tweets an hour after Josh's tweet that his document appears to be an authentic Burisma document, but has been edited. What was edited is unclear. Sounds exactly like the Ukraine war plan leaks from a couple of weeks ago. The documents are real, but someone must have edited them to put in all this false information about how many Ukrainians had died. They actually expected people to believe that, and I'm sure actually some people did. But one more. Day 8, Monday, October 12th. At 9 a.m., Attorney General Bill Barr holds a press conference to say the American people deserve the truth and that he has instructed the FBI to verify the allegations of Joe Biden and Hunter Biden's corruption. He announces that the Justice Department is investigating wrongdoing by Hunter Biden and Joe Biden for money laundering, tax fraud, theft of honest services, and acting as an unregistered foreign agent. In response to a reporter's question, he volunteers that he believes Joe Biden should submit to an FBI interview within days. Quite the fictional scenario. I wonder how they got so close to representing reality. Back to Lowenthal. When the Hunter Biden laptop story broke, the existence of the recent tabletop exercise became instant important news, but the journalists who'd attended stayed mum, perhaps granting off-the-record privileges to organizers. We totally blew it on our Burisma tabletop this summer. We didn't have Trump announcing lock him up until day 9 of the Burisma information operation, writes Garrett Graff, the Aspen Institute's Director of Cyber Initiatives. In the attached email, Graff goes on to say, Stephen said it was all going to move more quickly than we thought, and he was right. On the other hand, based on our timeline from August, we had Trump first announcing lock him up on Tuesday, October 13th, and he didn't actually say it until Friday the 16th, so he's running a few days behind schedule. Head slams into desk repeatedly, he writes in brackets, so this is all very amusing and funny to them. Lowenthal attaches an email in response to Garrett Graff by Noah Schachtman, who writes, LOL, okay, off the record, what's our working theory here of what happened? He's the current Rolling Stone editor-in-chief, by the way. Gotta get the fake news story straight. Last week, Secretary of State Antony Blinken was alleged to have instigated the Russian hack letter signed by 50 former Intel officials. At RightsCon, civil society's biggest digital rights event, Blinken spoke on disinformation with Nobel Prize winner Maria Ressa. See how it works? The people accusing others of disinformation run the biggest disinformation campaigns themselves. Anti-disinformation conferences team with Beltway journalists, the same names from the Post, Times, Atlantic, and NBC over and over. But these proto-censorship workshops are often off-record, like defense or intel confabs. Reporters are participants, not adversaries. And of course, that's a principle that we've all taken to heart over the last few years, but that many people don't even understand at all. They believe that journalists, just like these other organizations, are working in their own self-interest, trying to succeed through their own merit. And we're told the job of these journalists is to speak truth to power, to hold people in power to account. Even these journalists would tell us that that's what they're doing, but instead they are working with the people in power to assist them in their agenda. The entire thing is completely upside down. The scale of funding is similarly beyond shocking. Governments and foundations pour millions. One company alone reportedly won $979 million from the Pentagon into anti-disinformation firms and NGOs, and that is Peraton, as mentioned above. Craig Newmark is reported to have given more than $200 million to journalism projects. By another estimate, $338 million, including the founding funds for the Stanford Internet Observatory. And Newmark is one of those philanthropists that you will see over and over again when you are searching for various organizations and their funders on influencewatch.org. Whether it's the ADL with election miscreants, the Althea Group counting China-linked accounts, amplifying known right-wing figures, or the Atlantic Council monitoring quote-unquote opposition activity around the Iran deal, the NGOs make blacklists of wrong thinkers. The Twitter files are riddled with removal demands from opaque, cut-out organizations like the Center for Countering Digital Hate, whose mysterious funding never troubles either Twitter execs or the reporters who transmit their demands. Media forwards the blacklist demands to industry, and by industry he means the tech companies. Industry folds, and all the people from these groups, the same names over and over, get together for hors d'oeuvres at cozy conferences with NATO Stratcom, the Center for European Policy Analysis, the Carnegie Endowment, etc. One big club. He writes, here 12 attorneys general ask Twitter to deplatform the disinformation dozen. Twitter jumps into action to help. And these are the attorney generals of Connecticut, Delaware, Iowa, Massachusetts, Michigan, Minnesota, Letitia James in New York, North Carolina, Oregon, Josh Shapiro in Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, and Virginia. So that group of attorneys general wrote to Jack Dorsey and Mark Zuckerberg asking them to remove the accounts of the disinformation dozen, the very dangerous vaccine misinformation spreaders who, of course, turned out right about everything. Lowenthal goes on, nor was I prepared to read bluntly Orwellian communications like Twitter's cheery visibility filtering year in review newsletter, boasting of new innovations in soft intervention and the, quote, visibility filtering library. More surprising was the violation of commonly held privacy rules. Medan, one of Twitter's four main anti-disinformation partners on COVID, had an Omidyar-funded project called CryptoChat that advocated peering into private encrypted messages to weed out misinformation. And that's Pierre Omidyar he's talking about. Omidyar is the founder of eBay and, again, one of those major philanthropists that you will see listed as a donor to almost all of those crazy left-wing NGOs. In a similar vein, the Algorithmic Transparency Institute, a core virality project partner, conducted Stasi-style civic listening and automated collection of data from closed messaging apps to hunt down quote-unquote problematic content through its Junkipedia initiative. NGOs shill for corporate products. The Public Good Projects, a Twitter COVID misinformation partner, ran initiatives to, quote, increase vaccine demand. Li Fang's Twitter files revealed BioNTech sought Twitter's help to repress a vaccine equity campaign. And, worth noting, Li Fang, at least at the time, worked for The Intercept, which is owned by Pierre Omidyar. The story of the Twitter files and the censorship industrial complex is really the story of the collapse of public trust in experts and institutions, and how those experts struck back by trying to pool their remaining influence into a political monopoly. And that is surprisingly insightful for a Twitter files reporter. Most of them have seemed relatively clueless about the actual state of things, the big picture. You can hear Taibbi and Schellenberger on podcasts still ignorant to what the big picture is, despite being directly involved in the Twitter files reporting. It's interesting that Lowenthal picks up that this censorship regime, the extent to which they have gone, illustrates not a dominant level of control, but instead the control slipping away, and these companies and organizations and parts of government going to great lengths to maintain their ability to decide what constitutes truth in the public mind. Lowenthal writes, in the Twitter files, we repeatedly see terms like infodemic, information pollution, and information disorder, which express elite panic over the great technological explosion that has radically expanded the quote-unquote contagion of democratic participation. Again, very insightful from Lowenthal. They do not want an informed populace participating in their own government. All the platitudes about free speech and open societies and our democracy are meaningless. It's a total inversion within the false reality. They don't want anyone participating. That's why they don't count our votes. The Western anti-disinformation field, with its government collaboration and calls for more state control over speech and expression, is betraying human rights activists around the world who fight against online government repression. Let's put the non-governmental back into NGO and defund the anti-disinformation industry. After all, the information control shoe will one day be on the other foot. Lowenthal then links to a long article on Matt Taibbi's site, Racket News, where he does further analysis on these Twitter files issues and disinformation. He writes, at the most basic level, the idea that one day the shoe might be on the other foot seems beyond comprehension of most. The result is a court of clowns. Feedback is not being taken in. Pivots are not made. Epistemological entropy ensues. While progressives might believe they are in charge, I think it's much more the case that we are being used, and obviously he's including himself there among progressives. It is strange that all of these Twitter files reporters do identify this way. He writes, under the cover of social justice, the corporate machine rolls on. The U.S. government and its allies, realizing that information was the future of conflict, slowly but surely engineered a takeover of the independent adversarial organizations that should be holding them to account. And again, I would suggest that perhaps it's just been that way for a long time, and we were misled about it and misunderstood the world around us because of it. Twitter Files 21 is by Matt Orfalia, and he calls it How to Find Russians Anywhere. Part 1, Project Osprey. After the 2016 election, the Senate Intel Committee asked Twitter to identify accounts from Russia's Internet Research Agency, but both Twitter and third-party researchers struggled to find Russian agents. At first, Twitter was only able to produce 22, plus 179 IRA-linked accounts. Democrat Mark Warner called the numbers, quote, inadequate on every level. Twitter went back to the drawing board in an analysis project called Osprey. In Project Osprey, Twitter counted two types of Russians. The first type is what they call a priori Russians, identified as Russian by outside researchers like Q-Intel. The second type is what they call inferred Russians, identified by algorithm tracking signals like Cyrillic text or a Russian IP address. This kind of analysis based on markers like type of email carrier or retweeting history can quickly become a Rorschach test where you see what you want to see. If you look for that marker, then everything will look Russian, is how one industry analyst put it. He notes that even Twitter understood this. People like the Green Party candidate, Dr. Jill Stein, got swept up into this group of accounts linked to the other accounts they believed were Russian. Outrageous, says Stein, just more that Joe McCarthy would have been proud of. Another account deemed is Russian was WikiLeaks. Shown the attribution, Stella Assange said, WikiLeaks does not fit the definition, noting that anyone using surveillance-resistant search tools like the Tor browser might also be deemed Russian. Use of Tor would randomly result in false positives, Stella Assange said. Tor is an essential tool for civil liberties and privacy communities, she said. In the same Osprey document, Twitter notes the hashtag War Against Democrats, which the New York Times reported was posted a scary 1,700 times on Election Day, only garnered a microscopic 6,953 impressions, a hydrogen atom in Twitter's vast ocean of tweets. So something that was posted 1,700 times only got just under 7,000 impressions. So all those 1,700 posts were viewed an average of 4 times, which may as well be not at all. After Twitter's early attempts to identify Russian accounts resulted in such low numbers, they used different methodologies, tallying ever-increasing numbers of Russians from 22 to 201 to 2,700 to 2,752 to 3,124 in Osprey, and finally 3,814. This is how many Russians we've got. 3,814 Russian problems on Twitter. Even as Twitter began referring openly to IRA-linked accounts, the company had no way to make such identifications. They were only, quote-unquote, potentially connected. As policy chief Colin Crowell explained in late 2017, quote, we are citing accounts as IRA on the basis of third-party assessments, as we have no realistic way of knowing this on a Twitter-centric basis apart from educated guesses. Twitter knew that if they couldn't identify IRA accounts with certainty, outside researchers lacking Twitter's internal data couldn't either. Part 2. Russian troll hunters. They just don't have the chops. That's a quote from an email from Yoel Roth to other Twitter executives. The email is attached. Yoel Roth was responding to an email from a man named Kevin Kane, weighing in on who should be included in the group of experts and NGOs on their regular disinfo calls. Kane had suggested that they stick with the think tank and non-university crowd, as he describes them. Yoel Roth responds, I really like the idea of doing this. If nothing else, it streamlines some of the relationships that presently are just managed ad hoc by different individuals and creates a single touch point between those people and groups and Twitter. Nick, your list covers a lot of the folks I talk to on a regular basis. Only addition I might suggest would be Data and Society, maybe Dana, but possibly others in DNS as appropriate. They're doing lots of work around the census in addition to broader 2020 stuff. What are they doing around the census? I can't wait to find that out. I'd recommend against including the folks from Clemson. They're too chummy with HPSCI and have thrown us under the bus with overblown conclusions a few too many times. I get the keep your enemies close thing, but they just don't have the chops to back it up. So some of these organizations working with Twitter on the disinfo and censorship projects just apparently aren't very good or professional at what they're doing. If you look on Racket.News today, you'll see that MSNBC alone made hundreds of false claims of Russian meddling, citing the Hamilton 68 dashboard, which past Twitter files revealed to be tracking Americans, not Russian bots and trolls as claimed. Outside of Hamilton 68, about which Twitter stayed quiet despite internal knowledge that it was quote-unquote bullshit, Twitter analysts may have had the most disdain for Clemson's Media Forensics Hub, a major driver of print and TV cyber scare stories of Russian subversion. Clemson's troll hunter professors Darren Linville and Patrick Warren appeared in one media story after another, sometimes photographed with Hamilton 68 dashboards in the background, even warning that uplifting tweets could lead you into the dark clutches of a Russian troll. When asked how they knew an account was Russian, Warren confessed he can't be 100% sure, but Linville said he was certain. He wouldn't say how, though. Transparency just isn't possible, he said. Clemson's most certain troll hunter seemed to jump the gun in 2020 when he suggested hashtag Bloomberg is racist could be a Russian hashtag because it started that morning from the account DRK Warlord that, quote, lives somewhere in Asia because it posts when Americans should be sleeping. So because it's across the world and he's posting at times when Americans would be sleeping, because he's somewhere in Asia, is a Russian troll. The proof they have is that he's posting at times when Americans should be asleep. Now, I don't know what that could possibly mean. People aren't children. People will be awake and be asleep when it suits them and suits their lives. You got to work a 9 to 5? Well, you're probably going to be sleeping at night when everybody who has day jobs sleeps. Are you a bartender? Well, if so, then you're going to be up really late at night when everyone's already sleeping, and then you're going to sleep when those people are just starting to wake up. It's crazy how it works. You don't even have to be in Asia or Russia to be awake in the middle of the night when other people are sleeping. Back to Orphalea. That was false. It started prior to that morning and not by DRK Warlord, the hashtag he's referring to, who is an American living in the U.S., not Asia. When I asked why his sleep schedule seemed off, he laughed and told me, I'm a nurse at a hospital in Indiana. In 2020, I worked the night shift. So not Russian. Crazy, huh? This kind of mix-up appears to be what Twitter's Aaron Rodrigues was referring to when he noted the Clemson professor's, quote, constant tendency to find Russians and foreign interference every time they look for anything, end quote. Another example occurred with the hashtag DC Blackout hoax, as Twitter exchanged emails with the FBI describing the campaign as a, quote, small-scale domestic troll effort, not a significant bot or foreign angle. Linville described the campaign as having employed, quote, a classic Russian move. After a later Clemson report regarding inauthentic activity during vice presidential debates, Rodrigues decried, quote, their usual unsubstantiated claims of foreign interference, end quote, writing that they had to, quote, scrape the bottom of the barrel to find foreign interference, end quote. But to the Clemson researchers' credit, they found Twitter was scraping the barrel too, having looped in several Americans in a list of Russian bots given to Congress. So clearly, Twitter's own false positives didn't stop with its Project Osprey. The Americans found by Linville and Warren had been unjustly censored, suspended from Twitter without warning or explanation, thrown in a haystack of suspected Russians. Quote, they lost access to Twitter accounts that they used to maintain social and career connections, wrote Wired. And there's something a little bit off about Orphalea's claim here, because it's implying that there are actually good and legitimate reasons to take down people's accounts, but the false claims about them being Russian trolls doesn't meet the standard. And oh, by the way, everybody who was censored and banned and had labels applied to the things that they say on social media had their social and career connections affected. At some point, there is going to be hell to pay for censoring millions of people. After years of Red Scare stories citing the Clemson duo, Hamilton 68 and others, that fueled such awful censorship, Linville leveled with PBS in 2022. You know, Russian trolls aren't as common as people think they are, he says. And Orphalea wraps up by saying to be continued. So there's a part 3 called How to Find Disinformation Everywhere. So slowly but surely, the Twitter files are mapping out what they have begun to call the censorship industrial complex, We knew that something like this was at work. We've had proof of it for a couple of years now. I often mention that Judicial Watch released FOIA'd documents and emails from the California Secretary of State's office to the tech companies accessing portals and requesting censorship of American citizens for their political speech, which the California Secretary of State's office deemed to be mis or dis or malinformation in the lead up to the 2020 election. And my face appears in those FOIA documents. Some friends and I did a signature signing event for petitions on Governor Gavin Newsom's recall. And I talked about how the California Secretary of State's office had changed my voter registration, adding me to the permanent mail-in ballot list without my permission. What I said was, of course, completely true and provably true, because I certainly didn't put myself on that list and ended up on it somehow. So it was apparent at that time that the government and tech companies and other organizations were working in coordination to censor citizens. But all of that was ignored, and here we are 2 years later with the public finally just beginning to realize what all of this actually is. Now, switching subjects without a segue, there was a hearing yesterday before the House Judiciary Committee where a woman named Tara Lee Rodas gave testimony as a whistleblower about the U.S. government's role in a international child trafficking operation. This clip is a few minutes long, but it's well worth it.
Ranking Member Japal and distinguished members of the committee, it is an honor to be here. I thank you for the invitation to share my testimony. My goal is to inspire action to safeguard the lives of migrant children, including the staggering 85,000 that are missing. Today, children will work overnight shifts at slaughterhouses, factories, restaurants to pay their debts to smugglers and traffickers. Today, children will be sold for sex. Today, children will call a hotline to report they are being abused, neglected, and trafficked, and we don't know if they're going to get the help they need. For nearly a decade, unaccompanied children have been suffering in the shadows, and I have to confess I knew nothing about their suffering until 2021, when I volunteered to help the Biden administration with the crisis at the southern border. As part of Operation Artemis, I was deployed to the Pomona Fairplex Emergency Intake Site in California to help HHS, Office of Refugee Resettlement, reunite children with sponsors in the United States. I thought I was going to help place children in loving homes. Instead, I discovered that children are being trafficked through a sophisticated network that begins with recruiting in home country, smuggling to the U.S. border, and ends when ORR delivers a child to a sponsor. Some sponsors are criminals and traffickers and members of transnational criminal organizations. Some sponsors view children as commodities and assets to be used for earning income. This is why we are witnessing an explosion of labor trafficking. Now, whether it's intentional or not, it could be argued that the United States government has become the middleman in a large-scale, multi-billion-dollar child trafficking operation that is run by bad actors seeking to profit off of the lives of children. As for me, my interest is the safety of the children. I do not view this as a political issue. I view this as a humanitarian issue. I assure you, my motives are the highest and best. I want the children protected. So I want to tell you some of what I witnessed personally at the Pomona Fairplex. I saw vulnerable indigenous children from Guatemala who speak Mayan dialects and cannot speak Spanish. That means they cannot ask for help in English. They cannot ask for help in Spanish. They become captives of their sponsors. I have sat with case managers as they've cried to tell me the horror of what has happened to children as they make the journey to this country. I saw apartment buildings where 20, 30, and 40 unaccompanied minors have been released. I saw sponsors trying to simultaneously sponsor children from multiple ORR sites at one time. I saw sponsors using multiple addresses to obtain sponsorships of children, and I saw numerous cases of children in debt bondage, and the child knew they had to stay with the sponsor until the debt was paid. Realizing that we were not offering the children the American dream, but instead putting them in modern-day slavery with wicked overlords was a terrible revelation. A terrible revelation. These children are a captive victim population with no access to law enforcement or knowledge of their rights. They are extorted, abused, neglected. And that is why I blew the whistle in 2021.
Now, if you've listened to the show for a while, you will know that for a long time, I've been calling our immigration problem, our broken immigration system, a slave trade. And people think that that's a little extreme. I'm being hyperbolic when I say it. But I was not being hyperbolic. I was seeing the thing for what it is. Let's listen to how she describes this again.
I thought I was going to help place children in loving homes. Instead, I discovered that children are being trafficked through a sophisticated network that begins with recruiting in home country, smuggling to the U.S. border, and ends when ORR delivers a child to a sponsor. Some sponsors are criminals and traffickers and members of transnational criminal organizations. Some sponsors view children as commodities and assets to be used for earning income. This is why we are witnessing an explosion of labor trafficking.
That is exactly the scenario that I have been describing. Recruiting in the home country. People are not escaping gang violence. They are not escaping climate change. There are UN migration programs and affiliated NGOs figuring out who, among these decimated populations in countries impoverished by the global regime, who among them are the right candidates to be flown or shipped overseas, where they are handed off to the cartels, smuggled all the way up to the southern border and across it, a journey on which we regularly hear stories of just awful abuse, rape, assault, murder, people being kidnapped, people being forced to become drug mules or other sorts of mules. So the trip with the cartel itself is awful. Then they get over the border and affiliated NGOs send them all around the country to situations that are just as awful and probably more awful than their situation in the country they just left. They talk about the children being handed off to sponsors. We're told that children are being reunited with their families, or we're told that they are being put into caring homes where they'll be taken care of. That's not true. They're being handed off to largely unvetted sponsors, many of whom are criminals and traffickers themselves. And we have child labor. This is child indentured servitude because they owe back the money it cost to pay the cartel to bring them over the border in the first place. If that's not a slave trade, I don't know what is. This is just the modern day version of the slave ship process that we've heard about and read about in history books for our entire lives. And it's being run by the uniparty faction of the global regime in the United States. There is no substantive difference here between the slave stories of old, the slave ships, all of that, and what's happening now. It's a slave trade. This is not a conspiracy theory. And it's not me saying this. This is a woman who was part of the system deciding to come forward as a whistleblower and stating all of this in testimony before Congress. This is an international human trafficking operation, an international child trafficking operation, an international slave trade being run by the global regime and facilitated by the United Nations. It's not a conspiracy theory. It's a system. And they don't even hide the system. They just lie about what the system is actually producing. They tell you that they're doing the good thing. These people are in desperate situations. They want to come to America to have a better life. And all of this system is just facilitating that. You see, they're not going around to other countries collecting people to be used as indentured servants after being trafficked halfway across the globe. They're just saving these people from the terrible situations that the regime has created in their country. That, my friends, is a slave trade. It's not extreme. It's not hyperbolic. It's just true. I guess the conspiracy theorists win again. I'll be back tomorrow at the same reasonable time on the same Reasonable Podcast Network. I don't have a network. Masks and lockdowns don't work. They lied to you about a pandemic. And Joe Biden will never be president.
In my mind, that's the end game.
If you're listening to this episode for free, you can support me and support the show and the work I do by signing up for a paid subscription at imyourmoderator.substack.com. You can do so for as low as $50 a year or $5 a month. Comes out to under $0.25 per episode, and you'll blast right through the paywall for all of the writing. The merch store is www.cancelcouture.com, and you can find everything else by heading to Linktree. Linktree.com/I'mYourModerator. And I'll see you soon out on the range. It's hell!